based here in Brussels. We want to talk this afternoon with three speakers about the future of EU climate and energy policies. We are just a few weeks ahead of the climate summit, the COP30 in Brazil. And this is the right moment, we thought, to just do a kind of stock-taking exercise. What are the different proposals? What are the numbers on the table? And we will do this this afternoon for 1 hour. I have 3 questions for 3 speakers, and we will try to answer these questions within 3 minutes so that you afterwards also have some time to respond, to react, to discuss. You can post your questions in the Q&A box that you can find normally below on your screen. Write down your question. We can try to pick some of those and direct them afterwards to one of our 3 speakers for this afternoon. If you regularly join our webinars, you might already know one of our speakers, Wendel Trio, who is the author of our new policy brief that you see here. You can also download it, and Wendel will explain a bit more in detail some facts and figures, answer questions on the process for getting EU climate and energy targets. Maybe you have been there already 1.5 years ago when we sat together actually with Wendel in a previous webinar. The European Commission early 2024 had just published a communication on how to get to a 2040 climate target. And at that time, if I remember correctly, we were thinking, well, okay, it's still 1.5 years to go to the COP30, to the next big summit in Brazil. So it should be feasible to get a consensus by then. But of course, there was also some skepticism. And unfortunately, our fears were somehow confirmed. The whole process, the decision-making is not very clear at the moment. It's a bit stuck. We will try to find out more in detail. It might be that these 2035 and 2040 targets, 3% more or less, 3 years earlier, later, that might appear to be rather technical or a detail for climate and energy geeks like us. But it's, of course, in the end, quite decisive. And I'd like to hand over to Wendel now to introduce a bit of political context, because in the numbers, there's this CO2 devil that is in the detail, I think. And Wendel can show and explain us now a bit more what are these different trajectories on the potential pathways to a European climate target and why it really matters and what are the differences of the different proposals that are currently on the table that are discussed. Over to you, Wendel.
Thank you, Jörg. Thank you for the invitation to speak to this webinar. So to get immediately to the point, it is important to understand that we speak about 2 separate but strongly interlinked processes. One is an amendment to the climate law that has been proposed by the European Commission to adopt a 90% emission reduction target for the EU by 2040. As it is a legal amendment to the climate law, this has to be agreed by co-decision, meaning both the Council and the Parliament need to agree, the Council by a qualified majority, the Parliament by majority, and that will take a while, but it's very clear this can be adopted by a qualified majority within the member states. The second process is a 2035 target, which is part of the contribution that the EU will make to the international climate negotiations, and that has been long agreed. It's part of the Paris Agreement, actually, that the EU needs to introduce a 2035 target. It should have done that already in the beginning of the year. That hasn't happened. But to be clear, this is a UN submission, so it's only the Council that decides on that. The Parliament doesn't play a formal role, and it needs to be done by consensus. So there's a different approach here between the 2 targets. The importance, important to say, is that countries haven't yet agreed on the 2040 target, the position on the 2040 target, and therefore failed to agree on a 2035 target, because many countries feel that the two must be interlinked, and first there needs to be an agreement on 2040 before countries can agree on 2035. Because of that, the EU missed the deadline that the UN has set for end of September, which is a deadline for making a synthesis report. So the UN will look at all of the individual contributions from countries for their 2035 targets, will make a report, and will then kind of analyze whether countries are on track to achieve the 1.5 temperature limit that was agreed in Paris. Spoiler, the analysis will say countries are not going to reach that with or without the European Union. So the European Union has failed to do so, but felt inclined to do something before the end of September, and therefore they have made a statement of intent. And the statement of intent has the two numbers that are here in this graph, one which is 66.25% and the other 72.5%. It's important to note that these are linear trajectories between the current 2030 target, minus 55%, and the existing target for 2050, which is net zero. If you make a linear trajectory, you get in 2035 at minus 66.25%. If you make a linear trajectory from 2030 to 90% in 2040, if that target would be agreed, you get minus 72.5. So that's the statement of intent. The EU has said our NDC will be somewhere between those two, but we still have to decide. And so what's the process for final decision? A number of countries, with France mainly as one of the pushers, have asked for the discussion first to take place at the European Council, so by heads of state and leaders. As such, that is not surprising, because all of the previous targets, the Kyoto targets, the 2020, 2030, 2050 target, they have all first been agreed by the European Council, but that was with months of preparation. Now there have been no months of preparation, so the 23rd of October, this will be discussed by the European Council. It's highly unlikely that they will have an agreement. And then the Danish presidency is setting an extraordinary Environment Council on the 4th of November, which is a few days before the start of the climate summit in Brazil. They will set on 4th of November a special Environment Council, hoping that they can get agreement on a mandate for the 2040 target and get agreement on a position for a target for 2035. But what exactly will come out of that meeting is still hard to say. Definitely a number of countries are supporting the European Commission's 90% target, but there are also a number of countries, including Poland, Italy, etc., who are very unwilling to accept a 90% target at this moment. I'll leave it there. I've gone a bit beyond my 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Wendel, for this introduction. So Ursula von der Leyen confirmed when she was re-elected that she wants to continue towards net zero, towards climate neutrality in the year 2050. That is, of course, a bit far away. What we are struggling now with is actually the step in between the year 2040 from the European climate law, also for 2035, which is a mandatory kind of milestone that the European Union has to comply with when it comes to its role as a signatory of the Paris Agreement. Wendel already mentioned there is, of course, the Council. There are important meetings amongst heads of states and governments and the ministers, but there is also the Parliament. And we have one lawmaker here in the room amongst our speakers that I would like to welcome, Lena Schilling, who was elected in Austria for the Austrian Green Party. She has now the role of the shadow rapporteur on the European climate law. For those who don't know in detail these roles in the Parliament, every political group in the Parliament elects one member of the Parliament to negotiate really in detail the positioning of the Parliament on important files. So she's contributing to this. And with this difficult situation right now, Lena, how is it now to prepare a consensus, to be under such a pressure and to have to deliver in such a short time? It's only a few weeks until the COP.
Thank you so much for having me, and it is difficult. I just want to start with adding something, because you said, and that's rightfully so, Ursula von der Leyen committed to 90% decarbonization in 2040, domestic. And now we're having a proposal on the table that's not 90% domestic, it's 90% decrease of emissions within flexibilities. And there are 3 different kinds of flexibilities, a lot of details there, but it is not 90% anymore, even with the proposal we have on the table. Just to also make clear, this was even not easy to get. Then also in this whole process, we expected that proposal from the Commission much earlier. We thought the Commission will propose it with the Clean Industrial Deal in February or something, but it just was announced in the, I think, 2nd of July. And then it was clear it will be super tight, even with a normal timeline, because you have the committees in which you need to negotiate, but also the trilogue. So this whole thing was up for a very, very, very tight procedure. And then, and I think that's also clear, the political majorities in this parliament has shifted. And there we are seeing it's getting harder every day to negotiate because there are very different interests, and with an increasing far-right influence, where, and that's clear, the EPP always has to decide, will they work with the right or will they work with a progressive majority? And then something very, very dumb happened, because in this whole process of who is being the rapporteur for this file, the far right got it, because, and I have to say that's also the EPP's fault. The far right now was in the lead of the timeline of all of that for this file. So what we needed to do is to find a compromise, even from the beginning on finding informal meetings with EPP, S&D, and Renew. So with all the pro-democratic, pro-European forces in the parliament, to have an idea that we will finish. So I will make it short. Time-wise, it was extremely difficult, and also content-wise, because as I said, it's not just agreeing to 90%. The devil is really in the flexibilities and in the detail of what we can commit to, because that makes all of the difference. And there we have this one thing, and I just want to mention it briefly, because it is for me a very sensitive topic. They are introducing Article 6 international credits. And that is in a way super difficult, because they should be additional. Now it looks like they will be foreseen within the 90%, and we don't know much about it. It's announced as high quality international credits, but nobody really knows right now what that can mean. Is it DAX, BEX, biochar? I will not go too much into detail, but the fact is we really have not much time, and this climate conference is coming closer and closer. Maybe one positive note from the parliament side, not to be too depressing in my first statement. What we managed is to have a COP resolution as every year, where we actually have a number for the NDC in there, because in the whole process for the NDCs, the parliament doesn't really have a position. We have to negotiate 2040, but on the NDC for 2035, we have not much of a say. But in this COP resolution, we mentioned, at least in the ENVI committee, in the environmental committee, to have an NDC with 72.5% with the EPP. So it is still possible to get majorities on some things, but it is an uphill battle. It is super hard, and we really need the pressure right now from member states, and also from people on the streets, from citizens. Otherwise, I think we will not achieve it.
It's good that you try to end on a positive note, although the entire situation is not that really happy to compare it also with previous processes in the past years, when the targets were discussed and decided. Normally, we are used to see that the European Union is a forerunner, is really a pioneer, advancing with ambitious targets on the global stage, which kept this multilateral process, which is global climate policy, alive. And that is, I think, also maybe a point, not to be too negative again, but what better time than now for the European Union to be a leader again in global climate policy, now that the US has disappeared again, and that this whole process also on the global level is somehow in limbo. Do you think, Lena, that somehow with the help of the European Parliament and maybe of other stakeholders, other actors, do you think that the EU could still take somehow a forerunner position in Brazil in a few weeks?
If there is the political will, yes. If not, no. I think that's the easy question. That's the easy answer, because we still could negotiate an NDC. It's very unusual that the EU is so late with announcing an NDC. Then, as Wendel already said, then we just have this strange letter of intent in a ranch, whatever that will be. And now, if they and there it's also a bit above my pay grade. If the leaders of the member states would commit to a strong NDC, would commit to a strong climate target, of course we could play this role. But the reason is not that we are not able to. This whole proposal is not too complicated. It's not 200 pages. It's more like 20 pages with recitals. So it's doable. The question is just, is there the political will or not? And we have seen a lot of gambling before, especially between Merz and Macron, who are aligning in a very weird way, having deals, having a lot of demands. One of them is, of course, to kill the combustion engine ban, but a lot of other things. So I think the clear answer is, of course, we could take climate ambition worldwide again. We should rewrite it in every resolution. But and we as Greens do that. That's something I can say. But the question is if the council will commit to it or not. And we should look very closely, and we should also keep them accountable for what they are doing now, because this is major.
Okay, and before digging a bit deeper into the technicalities, you mentioned terms like flexibilities, Article 6, international credits. Wendel has another slide to explain more, but first of all, I would like to bring in our third speaker, Christian Forster. He's head of program department and member of the executive board from the German Green Business Association. And we already heard that there has been quite some pressure, not only from the member states, some politicians, national governments saying, let's push the pause button in climate policies. Let's slow down a bit. We also hear this from time to time from certain industries. Maybe not your members, because your member companies, more than 100 in Germany, also international corporate players, they want ambitious climate policies. They also are still responsible for quite some emissions. So my question to you, what was already mentioned as a potential entry point for building consensus, the international credits, meaning offsetting, when companies and or governments get an option to buy emission rights somewhere else outside of the European Union to fulfill the targets. Is this something that could help to build a consensus? Is it the hand that reaches out to those companies, to those member states that have difficulties, that are a bit hesitant, that are lagging behind, to get them on board, just to have a consensus? Could this be something that works? How do you see this from a corporate perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jörg, and the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung for having me here. I would like to share some practical examples and also some perspectives. And actually, just a few words about us. So we have actually more than 260 members, large corporations, medium-sized enterprises, and of course, energy-intensive industries, such as steel and chemicals. And I fully agree what Lena also said. The timeline has shifted and the pressure has risen, absolutely. So I fully agree on that. But still, like, we need to find some individual for those companies, some investments, and so a lot of companies already shifted then to more investment in climate and CO2 neutral policies. So, and that's what we advocate for, is a pragmatic, innovation-oriented approach, and emphasize that climate policy and economic strength must go hand in hand. So it's undeniable that within the industry, there's a broad spectrum of positions, such as Lena mentioned, the pressure has risen. And I've been just today to the panel discussion where we saw huge pressure, especially from those energy intensive companies. So they want a clear pathway, and that is what we emphasize for. We want a clear pathway because already investments have been done, and with this whole situation now, we need robust standards, credible investments, and a smart EU politics. Investment security is, I believe, that what the companies in this time frame need most, because if we roll back right now, then we see also that the targets will not be will not be set. And so we advocate that so if we offset those targets, it would lead to lower standards, weak monitoring, or double counting. It would undermine the climate ambitions. So we need clear and stable rules for that. So back to you, Jörg.
Okay, thank you. Clear call for investment security and clear rules orientation guidance on the EU level. Let's see how the EU took this up. What are the proposals actually in detail that are on the table? In July, there was this proposal coming from the European Commission on future climate targets. Lena already mentioned credits, this idea to use international emission rights, to trade them, to buy them, and to allow these certificates to account and to offset basically emissions that you produce domestically. So for the numbers and the facts and figures, we have Wendel, of course. What would this really mean in terms of emission reduction in practice when we look into the figures that the Commission has suggested, in particular when it comes to these famous 3% offsetting that were suggested?
Yes, thanks. So it's very clear that the Commission in their proposal in July have tried to create a number of flexibilities, increase the number of flexibilities in order to get greater support from member states. And one of those is the introduction of international credits. People say, oh, it's only 3%, is that important, etc. That's 3% from the 1990 perspective. But if you look at it from the 2040 perspective, and actually the remaining emissions under a 90% proposal would be that there's 464 gigatons of CO2 equivalent still in the system in Europe. If you add to that 3% of 1990 emissions, that would suddenly increase the 464 to a much larger number. Actually, it would increase the number by about 30%. So it's very important that from the total remaining emissions, 1/3 would be coming from abroad and would be supporting actually emission reductions abroad. So it's much more important than you actually see. On top of that, the Commission or the EU already has another form of offsetting, which is the internal offsetting, which is the flexibilities that people are speaking about, etc. And so a large of these amount of these internal flexibilities relate to the fact that while in the early days up to 2020, the European Union had gross emission reduction targets, so really targets of the amount of emissions that would be reduced. The revised 2030 target was the -55, became a net target, meaning not only looking at emissions, but also at removals. And of course, the proposed -90% target is again a net target, which means that it includes removals. And while it is not specified within the proposal on the 90% what exactly the amount of removals would be, if you look at the earlier proposal, the communication from last year, you can see that there's a huge amount of removals being introduced, both natural removals, meaning mainly forests, as well as industrial removals, mainly bioenergy related to carbon capture and storage, and direct air capture, technical solutions that are not really existing at the moment, so many people don't know about them. But if you take all of that together, the 90% emission reduction target would actually only be a 79% reduction target, and the rest would be removals and international offset. And that's kind of very different from 90%. So it is important to look behind the numbers and to see that what the current proposal actually is that it's not as ambitious as it should be, knowing that in order to have a fair contribution from the EU to the target to limit temperature rise to 1.5, the EU would actually need to get close to zero emissions already in 2014.
So I think it's clear science told us 90% emission reduction by 2040 is the absolute minimum to be in line with 1.5 degree maximum global warming, to stick to the Paris Agreement. But well, politics is another story, and you see then how percentage figures might mean something different, and that there is quite a big difference. Can we build a consensus here in the room? We would like to bring in a little interactive exercise with you, with the participants here in the Zoom room. We can start a little survey, a poll, where we suggest to you 4 potential answers to the question: the option to offset 3% of emissions outside of the EU, what was just explained by Wendel. What do you think about that? Is this option, this offsetting with the credits, is it first not acceptable because it undermines climate ambition? Or do you think it is acceptable if strict rules limit the purchase and the counting of these credits? Third option, yes, well, a solution to build consensus on the 90% target. Yes, it's an option that you would agree to. Or last but not least, if you're not sure, it's not very clear and it requires further assessment before taking a decision. Let's see how you think about this question. Can we, we will maybe leave a bit of time for those who have not yet clicked. You're not obliged, of course. Okay, I see numbers are increasing, and we can maybe see the result now. The poll is ending. I see that most of participants in the room say that it is not acceptable because this offsetting would undermine climate ambition. It's more than 40%. And those who say, well, under certain conditions, that's 17 and 28%. Okay, it's a bit divided, to be honest. And of course, it depends really on the conditions. Thanks a lot for this little interactive exercise here. I would suggest that we now look a bit into the concrete details of implementing EU climate and energy policies, namely the EU emissions trading system. We already talked about trading certificates. EU ETS has proven as one of the very effective instruments that work very well. Christian, over to you. There's a clear price signal, the polluter pays in the industry sectors. There's a pressure to quit fossil fuels. On the other hand, it's also, of course, the question, can companies still be competitive? That is what they often complain about, what you hear sometimes from certain sectors. What do you think about it? How do the energy intensive and these energy and emission intensive industries perceive the challenge of the emissions trading system?
Yeah, I believe that also the survey shows that the EU emission trading system is then also not only for individuals, but also for companies, a core instrument for driving decarbonization while maintaining a market-based approach. So the key concern now, as mentioned before, is predictability. So if political debates lead to delays, exemptions, or an oversupply of certificates, the ETS system could lose its steering effect. So this would undermine both the competitiveness and the investment security, especially for energy and emission intensive industry that need clear long-term price signals to make the necessary low carbon investments and financially viable. So to ensure that the ETS is functioning, the EU should, in my opinion, maintain the scarcity, provide the target support then for industry facing high transformation costs without weakening the overall climate ambitions, and reinvest the ETS revenues into innovation, skill development, and also social programs. So addressing both the investment gap and the skill gap. And communicate clearly so that the ETS is not only a burden, but it's a pathway to competitiveness through innovation and effectiveness. So in short, we as a Green Business Association support strongly the ETS. And also, as mentioned from you before, you had the saying, you were saying that it's quite negative viewed from industry and from business. So we will give you some examples also from our member companies who strongly support the ETS. So, for example, Vonovia, which is a German housing company, Techem, which is an energy efficiency company, Transdev, who is working on mobility in cities, Interzero, which belongs to the Schwarzgruppe, who's a grocer, but they do specifically the circular economy, Gazak, which is energy provider in Germany, and Salzgitter, who is a steel producer. And they all support the ETS system because they have already investment and need this mid to long-term approach that it's credible.
Okay, it's a call for reliability that I hear also there. When it comes to another instrument, we have technology-specific targets for renewable energy, for energy efficiency in the European Union. In the Clean Industrial Deal, basically, the European Commission again stressed that for having and preserving a really competitive EU industry, we will need more cheap renewable electricity very quickly. On the other hand, there is an interesting debate about technology neutrality, not to have technology-specific targets to increase the growth of renewables, but just to have, for instance, a target for electrification of our energy consumption to increase the share of electricity that we consume, or just to drop any technology-specific references to have just emission reduction targets. Why is it so important to have also dedicated energy targets to achieve emission reductions? That is a question we can dig into together with Wendel, who again has one little chart to explain a bit how this technology-specific approach worked out in the past years and what it means for the future of EU's emission reductions.
Yes, thank you, Jörg. Maybe to start, it is very important that the current debate is really only about the climate targets, and that the debate about the policy framework will come later. So in that sense, there is not really a formal debate on will there be energy targets or not, but a number of countries have been resisting these energy targets for a while. And as you may know, we had binding renewable energy targets for member states up to 2020, but we no longer have these binding targets for member states for 2030. And similarly, we had a binding target for energy efficiency, and that became an indicative target for energy efficiency. So those targets are definitely under threat, and it's important to note that they play an important role, because only relying on the emissions trading scheme or only relying on a climate target will not be sufficient to bring us where we need to be. And we have seen that this has created quite a lot of inequalities between sectors if we don't really have a clear approach. The power sector has been decarbonizing rapidly thanks to the renewables and the energy efficiency targets. But on the other hand, the transport sector, for instance, has a bit done the opposite. They have seen their emissions increased, and agriculture sector has also been lagging behind, etc. So it's very important to have these sectoral targets, to continue with the renewables and energy efficiency targets, but also to look at other sectoral targets in order to ensure that we have this level of progress that is needed in all the different sectors. In this graph, you see the difference between the sectors, and you also see these white and red bars on each of the sectors. Those refer to what member states are proposing within their national energy and climate plans, the NECPs. And you see that we are not yet on track. We have the same problem that we have internationally with countries contributing to the 1.5 degrees Celsius targets. We also have this problem at the EU level, where member states have agreed on collective targets at the EU level, but are not necessarily bringing in their national contribution. It is important to note, because the Öko Institute, for instance, has calculated that the renewable energy target alone has contributed an additional 18% of emission reductions on top of the other instruments. So it is important to note that these energy targets really make sense, and that we need to continue having them both at the EU level, but also at member states level, to ensure that member states make their contribution to these targets. Thanks.
And we know, thank you, Wendel, we know from the European Green Deal that there was and still is a rather consistent framework of targets, of policies under this famous Fit for 55 package, under this umbrella, where you have a dedicated renewable energy target, an energy savings target, sector-specific targets that address different industries and so on. And this is all now to be implemented, of course. Fit for 55 is more or less on track. It's not perfect, of course. But what we might see is an overhaul of this entire architecture of EU policies to trickle down to design these policies sector specifically, technology specifically, yes or not. What I would like to know maybe from Lena, how you perceive this debate in the parliament. Will we see after Fit for 55 one day a Fit for 90 package maybe?
I really hope so. It's clear that we need a post-2030 package, and we hopefully get a Fit for 90 package. And I think that's where I need to start. The problem right now is that we're not on the path of implementing things. We're on the path of weakening things, destroying things. So with the political reality I'm seeing now today, I am deeply concerned, because we are in the parliament. There are a lot of debates on weakening ETS 1, destroying ETS 2, and a lot of other policies that we're already or on the path of implementing, are implemented partly, are getting destroyed. And with this political majority, in this political landscape, it is super difficult to fight progressively for even more. But of course we need to, because the package that we have now, we should continue it. And then we have also to talk about the European Renewable Grids Act. And there are a lot of acts that should be started also. And there was a lot of rumor about there will be this 90 package for in the second half of 2026. But for now, and that's what we are seeing more omnibuses on a lot of different topics. There will be an environmental omnibus, there will be an omnibus on REACH. We expect it for a long time. And also the Green Deal as a core milestone is getting attacked now. So I really hope we will manage. But for now, we need a lot of help from the industry that is telling us, hey, we need this clear path. We need clear indications from a lot of different players, because otherwise we will lose this battle on the way to 2030 already. And then there will be never a Fit for 90. But we need to be Fit for 90.
Thank you, Lena. I think I need to explain this omnibus technical term. It's the umbrella technical term from the European Commission for new legislative proposals that they put on the table now under the second Ursula von der Leyen Commission, to remove certain elements of EU laws that are already in place, that have just been endorsed a few months ago in certain cases, but where the Commission tries to remove bureaucracy. They call it's a simplification effort. And of course, it's difficult to say, yes, I want more bureaucracy. I am against simplification. And there are, of course, also voices from different industry sectors that ask for less bureaucracy, rightly so, I think, in certain cases you can discuss. But in the end, that would be my question to Christian now. When it comes to this simplification narrative, this debate, if the EU level removes standards or loosens some monitoring, if it renounces to binding targets, will this really help you? Or is this really answering the needs of your members? Are there other things? Is it really on the EU level where we could help?
Well, yeah, the EU's ideas are often useful, but the implementations are frequently very complex. So CBAM, for example, is then a good example. So we need to ensure a level playing field in the single market with standardized values. Could talk about the challenges for European business. The investment gap and skill gap clearly stands out. Companies across all sectors face difficulties in finding qualified workers and securing the necessary capital for the green and digital transformation. So in general, at the same time, there's a growing expectations from the EU level to make regulations simple and more effective. But nobody likes, of course, bureaucracy. So the simplification narrative sounds appealing, but if simplification means then removing standards and weakening monitoring or abandoning binding targets, we need to ask whether this would truly help the industry in its transformation. So for business, investment security, as Lena mentioned also again, depends on stability and predictability. So if the rules that we only recently adopted under the Green Deal are now being rolled back, it is undermining the confidence in Europe and its reliable location for sustainable investment. So simplification should therefore not mean deregulation, but smart regulation. That's always easy then spoken out, but when help of individual that is clear and consistent, this would be future orientated.
Yeah, for sure. So there has to be a certain investment security. That's what you again stress. Removing targets, removing standards is of course also somehow jeopardizing investments that have already been done. I remember also a conversation we had in one of our previous webinars when we presented our Green Deal Risk Radar, looking into the most important laws that are currently under attack, where there is certainly this kind of backlash. And there was also, speaker from the industry saying, wait, we just have started getting into these rules and are now rolling out these standards. That's a kind of stop-start policy that is, of course, not always very helpful. So when it comes to pushing for more ambition and getting really the emission reductions that we need, in the end, maybe a last question to Lena, more from a strategic perspective, to increase the pressure on EU policies. Before you became a member of the European Parliament, you have been very active with Fridays for Futures, with the climate movement. What could be the perspective for the social movements? What do you recommend? What could be the role of the climate movement in the situation where we don't know where we get with the 2040 targets?
I think I would never recommend the climate movement something. There I'm always a bit careful. But I think, and that's also what Christian just said, it is really about alliances. And it's much broader than the climate movement. And there I want to do another step. When I started with the climate movements, we could have never done it without Grandparents for Futures and Parents for Futures and CEOs for Futures were a very important part of our strategy. So in all of the question of where movements are standing, I think the important question is where are citizens standing? And we see in the Eurobarometer and in also other polls that people in Europe actually want climate ambition and that we have these alliances. And there we need to be stronger, there we need to be more united and better connected and find also alliances that are helping each other in improving policies, because nobody's against simplification. It's okay to look at a legislation again and see, okay, what can we do better? But it's not okay to deregulate without a democratic process. And there's a difference. That's maybe the step where I want to get back, because one proposal where we just recently saw that is the due diligence proposal. And there we had a lot of companies from IKEA to like the biggest companies saying, hey, we are already implementing it. What are you guys doing? And getting actually pissed because this back and forth is not helping us. And there we have this very different alliances from investors that are actually saying we need stability. And also, and that's maybe the point coming back, the only thing I really would, if I have had a wish to the climate movement, it would be that young people, even if they're frustrated, are not giving up. Because also I started 6-7 years ago and we're still on this table and we see now this backlash. And 10 years ago, with the Paris Agreement, there was this big promise of 1.5 degrees. We will take care of it. And we are betraying this promise that we gave young people. And I think there is a lot of anger, there's a lot of frustration, but we need to do it together, and giving up is simply not an option on this one. So alliances and broader alliances, and we need to fight again.
Okay, let's try to turn this legitimate anger into positive energy and also close this conversation, first of all, with short recommendations that Wendel has compiled. As I mentioned, we recently have published this little policy brief. Over to you, Wendel, to summarize a bit what are our proposals for the EU policy process so that it's not that stuck as we saw it in the beginning.
Yes, thank you, Jörg. I will go quickly through these 5 proposals that are not necessarily the full package, but are definitely 5 interesting elements of the future climate and energy framework. First of all, we need a long-term vision that goes beyond 2050. I mean, we now know that in order for us to contribute to limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, we will need to go into what is called net negative emissions. So meaning we remove more emissions out of the atmosphere than we put into that. That needs really a vision long term of how we're going to achieve that with intermediate targets. We should stop of having kind of these debates around new targets every 5 years. We should ensure that we set targets and then we revise them based on new knowledge that we have, the new international reality, etc. But we should start with setting a long-term vision with clear intermediate targets, not only for the EU as a whole, but actually also for member states. I think we should do the same exercise with member states, really having long-term visions and having economy-wide targets for all of the intermediate steps in between. So that's kind of a very first thing. It's developing a long-term vision that should kind of help us to achieve the 1.5 objective. Secondly, we need to start from the need for a complementary policy mix. So climate and energy policies are not just based on price policies. There is a need for carbon pricing, whether that's in the form of the ETS or anything else is another debate, but there's a need for carbon pricing. But there's also a need for regulatory measures, for setting certain rules that companies, that citizens, that governments, etc., have to abide to. And thirdly, we also need to look at how can we develop policies that help individual people, help companies, help local authorities in the changes that are needed in terms of how do we consume and produce and so on and so on. So there's need for pricing, regulation, and stimulation, and all those need to be elements of a complementary policy mix that needs to be there now, but also in the future. Thirdly, on top of that, and as part of the policy mix, we need to prepare for the end of the emissions trading system. The emissions trading system currently, the ETS1, will come to an end with the current elements, will come to an end in 2039. The ETS2 that still has to start will come to an end in 2044. We see that there's already people putting into or making proposals to put in new elements in the ETS, for instance, to put in removals in the ETS, etc., in order to keep the ETS alive. I think we should stop doing that. It should be clear the ETS has its role to play in reducing emissions. It doesn't have a role to play in increasing removals. And we need to look at different price signal mechanisms for different purposes. We should not kind of try to prolong the life of the ETS because people feel that it has been such an interesting tool, or because people's jobs are clearly linked to the continuation of the emissions trading scheme system beyond 2040. For fossil fuel phase out, the European Union, together with all of the countries of the world, have actually committed to phase out fossil fuels as part of what is called the first global stocktake under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change 2 years ago. It is very clear that the EU has not put in place specific policies to make that phase out of fossil fuels happen. The EU doesn't have a coal phase out date. It doesn't have a gas or oil phase out date. Some of the member states have, but the EU as a whole doesn't have that. And it is very clear that if you really want to make this fossil fuel phase out happen, that you need to plan for it, that you need to set clear targets for when that will happen. And of course, that needs to be accompanied by the kind of measures that you're going to take to ensure that this phase out is a just transition, and that includes the targets for renewable energy, that includes targets for energy efficiency, but that of course also includes measures to ensure that both people, workers, etc., are safe under this phase out of the use of fossil fuels. And fifth, we need to make sure that our international policies and our domestic policies are aligned with each other. If we're really keen about getting into achieving the 1.5 degrees, we need domestic policies that go for the utmost ambition. And on top of that, we need to support, in particular, poorer countries in the world to also achieve their emission reductions that are needed, not to compensate and to ensure that we have to do less in Europe, but to add on to very ambitious policies in Europe, and ensuring that also internationally we get all the countries on track, even the poorest, for the full transition that is needed to achieve 1.5 degrees. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wendel, for this very quick run through the key policy proposals that we have developed in this short policy brief that you can download. You find the link in the chat box. Also, for those who want to dig deeper into the details, what's going on in the EU bubble with EU laws, the whole European Green Deal, where are we with implementation, what's coming up. We have set up last year this European Green Deal risk radar, where we try to update you, give you an overview of the different legislative files that are going on. What are the important deadlines, and to what extent are these European Green Deal achievements under a certain threat of being slashed, being watered down, or altered in one of those famous omnibus packages that Lena already mentioned. So it's not the public transport that we like a lot, but it's rather, yeah, as some name it, it's more a kind of deregulation initiative where we have to be very careful if we really help to facilitate things and make policies simpler and less bureaucratic, or if we just undermine the whole effort and trust in EU policies. So I would like to invite you, participants in the room, for the last few minutes, just feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box so that we can maybe also have a little discussion with our three speakers here in the room. And I see that there is one question, an interesting one that might be relevant in particular for Christian, coming from Merve Güngör. Sorry for potentially misspelling this name. Thank you, Merve, for your question. I will read it for everybody. How do you see the role of voluntary industry standards versus national or EU level regulation? It looks like voluntary standards for net zero and carbon accounting are set to solve regulatory questions recently. Do you see this useful? Question mark. Maybe Christian or anybody else wants to answer. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Of course, there's always we need role models in that sense. So voluntary action is and the first move advantage can be very good for companies as well. Also, like thinking in long and midterm. But if that is not possible to achieve, then standards in reduction as economy in general, then we need of course rules, and that makes sense, and everyone agrees actually then also from our member companies. We need the same conditions then for everyone, and if usually that's the first step, I believe, then also from a government. So, and if the government sees then lack of enforcement from the participation, then we need certain rules. But individual cases, some companies, of course, then produce also in a way that it is already the new companies in general, or the companies with also a high budget, that it is possible for them to reduce the CO2 emissions. Thinking in long, as said before, in mid and long terms, what we think that the costs are always higher in not acting than there are in acting now. Not also for individual companies, but for the economy in general.
Yeah, thank you. I saw Lena and Wendel, you also might want to respond briefly. We have still some time, I think.
I can make it very brief. I very much agree with what Christian just said. Just adding also, we're then discussing this level playing field all the time. And often we're not calculating that we are actually subsidizing fossil fuels. And then you don't have like this voluntary standard, because as long as the market is not playing by the same rules for all fuels or whatever, then it's not working. And as long as fossil fuels are subsidized, as long as we have not this level playing field, I find it hard to just say voluntary. And therefore, I'm really, really strongly recommending to have clear regulatory for all.
Wendel, do you want to add?
I have not much to add, and I saw that there's other questions coming in. So, but I think that it's very clear that voluntary standards can never replace regulatory measures. I think there needs to be a number of regulatory measures as part of the broader vision. And if there are certain companies that want to go further, then that should of course be applauded. But in general, where voluntary measures have been put in place in order to avoid regulatory measures, we have not seen many positive evaluations of those voluntary approaches.
Okay. Thank you very much. I see a very topical question that we also have been discussing a lot within Heinrich-Böll Foundation in the past months. That is coming from Jakub Parol. I hope my pronunciation is improving now. How can we make sure that the ambitious climate goals that we would like to achieve would be socially just and would not be mostly harmful for social groups or even whole countries characterized by the low income? Who wants to respond to this question? Wendel, please go ahead.
Yeah, a very pertinent question, and I think it's very important that those policies are put in place. Now, unfortunately, we see that in quite a number of EU countries, we see the opposite happening irrespective of climate policies, but that policies are put in place that do the opposite, that instead of increasing social justice, that increase social inequality. So it's very clear that you cannot separate climate policies from other social policies. They need all to move together, and we need policies that ensure greater equality and justice on all fronts, not only on climate change. And it's very important because sometimes certain people who are not very positive towards climate measures use this kind of just transition and the fact that certain policies are favoring the rich over the poor. They're using that to reduce the level of climate ambition. And that's definitely not the way to go, because the biggest challenge, the biggest impacts from climate change will be on poor people. They will be the one that will be suffering most if we fail to really set ambitious policies and implement them. I think that is the crucial issue. It is the poor people, it is low wage workers, etc., that will have the biggest impact. So for them, we need both ambitious climate policies and ambitious equality policies. Thank you.
Lena or Christian, do you want to complement or fine? Good.
From a macro perspective, as I study economics, so make it the transition tangible on a local level, use the carbon revenues for redistribution, ensure in inclusive policy design, and support a fairness across all the member states, just as Wendel also mentioned. So, yeah.
And we did not dig deeper into this, for sure, very important topic in this webinar, because with Heinrich-Böll Foundation and the Green European Foundation, we are organizing a big public event in Brussels on the 12th of November. You're invited, of course, to discuss tools to boost citizens' participation in the energy transition to let really all households, in particular the low-income ones, benefit better from what renewables, cheap renewables, energy savings measures can deliver. And luckily, we have quite some good instruments on the EU level that can help to bring those benefits to the households. Think about energy sharing, think about targeted support schemes, and so on. This is something we will discuss, and where you can also find quite some recommendations on our website for those who want to dig deeper. Thanks, Jakub, for your question. Then there is still one, maybe very, very briefly, that's a bit difficult. Common agriculture policy from Shalini Bhutani is EU's cap the agriculture policy until 2027 on track to make European agriculture climate neutral by 2035? I don't think so. Without being an agriculture expert, honestly. I'm sorry.
The brief answer is no.
Yeah. Shalini, you can find more details in our risk radar, in our European Green Deal risk radar, where we have at least 1-2 fact sheets on the CAP strategic plans and more on the details where we discuss this. But for the time being today, agriculture, unfortunately, is not our focus for this webinar. But yeah, we hope to give some guidance orientation in that regard. Thank you all for the questions. Super interesting. Thanks for this feedback from the audience for the end. Now it's already 6 Brussels time. I can only say a very big thank you to our 3 speakers for taking the time to share your views here today with us. Also, thank you to all those colleagues who made this webinar possible today. Our next big public event, I already mentioned it, for the public relations, it's on the 12th of November in Brussels on boosting citizens' participation in the energy transition. We will close this webinar in a moment, but after closing the webinar, you will see a survey where we would like to ask you to fill in what you think about this webinar, to get your feedback, to rate us, and you can also suggest topics that we should cover in one of our next publications or webinars. So without further ado, thanks a lot, have a nice evening, and see you soon. And don't forget the survey, please. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.